On the morning of July 2nd, 1881, President James Abram Garfield walked into the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C., arm in arm with his Secretary of State, James G. Blaine. He was in high spirits. Congress had finally adjourned. He had just delivered a commencement address at his alma mater. Williams College was waiting, and for the first time in months he was escaping the suffocating heat of the Capitol to join his wife Lucretia at the New Jersey shore. At 9:20 a.m., the station waiting room was almost empty. President James Abram Garfield had barely taken 10 steps when a small, shabby man stepped from behind a bench, raised a .44 caliber British Bulldog revolver, and fired twice. The first bullet grazed the president's right arm. The second entered his back 4 inches right of the spine, fractured the 11th rib, and came to rest behind the pancreas, never touching a major artery or the spinal cord. President James Abram Garfield collapsed. The assassin, Charles Julius Guiteau, stood calmly as police seized him. He announced to the crowd, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. Arthur is president now." That single act, 90 seconds in a train station, would kill President James Abram Garfield, but not quickly. It would take 80 days of agony, turn the White House into a sick room, expose the ignorance of American medicine, and change the presidency forever. Who was President James Abram Garfield, and how did he become the target of a delusional office seeker? Born in a log cabin in Ohio in 1831, President James Abram Garfield was the last president born in poverty. He worked as a canal boat driver, put himself through Williams College, became a classics professor, a lay preacher, a Civil War general at age 31, and entered Congress in 1863. In 1880, he went to the Republican Convention in Chicago simply to nominate Ohio's John Sherman. After 35 deadlock ballots, the delegates suddenly turned to President James Abram Garfield himself as a compromise between the reform half-breeds led by Blaine and the machine stalwarts led by Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York. On the 36th ballot, President James Abram Garfield, against his own protests, was nominated. To balance the ticket, the stalwarts forced Chester Allen Arthur, Conkling's loyal lieutenant and former collector of the Port of New York, onto the vice presidential slot. President James Abram Garfield won the election by fewer than 10,000 popular votes. But the real war began the day he took office. President James Abram Garfield refused to let Roscoe Conkling control federal patronage in New York. When Conkling demanded the lucrative collectorship of the port as his price, President James Abram Garfield nominated his enemy instead. Conkling resigned from the Senate in a theatrical huff, expecting re-election by the New York legislature as proof of his power. The legislature refused. Conkling's career was finished, and dozens of stalwart office seekers were suddenly desperate. One of them was Charles Guiteau. Guiteau was a failed lawyer, failed evangelist, failed bill collector, and serial con man who had been in and out of the Oneida Free Love Commune and multiple insane asylums. During the campaign, he had delivered exactly one speech, for which he billed the President James Abram Garfield team $15, and he convinced himself he had swung New York and therefore deserved the consulship in Paris. He pestered the White House and State Department daily. On May 14, 1881, Secretary Blaine finally lost patience and told him, "Never bother me again about the Paris consulship as long as you live." Guiteau took it as a personal betrayal. In his twisted mind, God now spoke directly. Remove President James Abram Garfield, make Arthur president, save the Republican Party, and the grateful stalwarts would reward him. He borrowed $15, bought the ivory-handled revolver because it would look good in a museum someday, and stalked the president for weeks, once even following Lucretia Garfield to the train station, but sparing her because she looked ill. Back in the railroad station, doctors rushed President James Abram Garfield to the White House on a mattress. The chief physician, Dr. D. Willard Bliss, who insisted on being called Doctor with a capital D, took charge. In 1881, American surgeons still rejected Joseph Lister's antiseptic revolution. Bliss probed the wound with unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, searching for the bullet that he wrongly believed was on the left side of the body. He never found it because it was on the right. Over the next 11 weeks, he and other doctors would insert their bare fingers and metal probes into the wound hundreds of times, turning a survivable injury into a fatal one. President James Abram Garfield lingered through a brutally hot Washington summer. Pus poured from the wound. His weight fell from 200 pounds to 130. Alexander Graham Bell hurried to the White House with a primitive metal detector, but Bliss allowed him to scan only the left side. The nation watched in horror as bulletins were posted hourly. Makeshift air conditioning, fans blowing over blocks of ice, lowered the bedroom temperature from 95 to 75 degrees. On September the 6th, a special train carried the dying president to the seaside cottage at Elberon, New Jersey. Thousands lined the tracks in silence. At 10:35 p.m. on Monday, September 19th, 1881, 80 days after the shooting, James A. Garfield died of massive blood poisoning and a ruptured aneurysm caused by the infection. The bullet itself had done almost no damage. Chester Arthur took the oath of office privately in his New York home at 2:15 a.m. on September 20th. He wept when told of President James Abram Garfield's death. Public fury turned against the stalwarts and the spoils system that had produced Guiteau. Guiteau's trial began in November. He sang, recited bad poetry, insulted the jury, and insisted the doctors had killed President James Abram Garfield, not him. The jury took less than an hour to convict. On June 30th, 1882, he was hanged in the District of Columbia jail. His last words were a child's poem he had written, "I am going to the Lordy." The tragedy had one lasting consequence. In 1883, President Arthur, defying his old machine friends, signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, creating the merit-based federal civil service we know today. The assassin who wanted to restore the spoils system accidentally destroyed it forever. President James Abram Garfield served only 200 days as president. But in death, he gave America a government that could no longer be bought and sold by men like Charles Guiteau. That is the true story behind every frame of Death by Lightning.